Welcome to Urban Crime Chronicles, where we bring you nothing but the truth. Philadelphia has been a dangerous place since the beginning of time, from guns and drugs to lost lives, from the Black Mafia family back in the days to Kibani Savage, and now young dudes that run the street causing havoc and taking lives. When the Black Mafia family was at it, they were all the way involved in the heroin trade, and violence came with it. Its ferocious crews of gunmen grew around burly founder Sam Christian, the most feared man on Philly streets. They developed close ties with the influential Nation of Islam, and soon were executing rivals, extorting bookies connected to the city's powerful Costa Nostra crew and other local gangs. The Black Mafia was responsible for over 40 killings, the most chilling being the 1973 massacre of 2 adults and 5 children in Washington, D.C. But violence in Philly would not end when law enforcement stepped in, locking many of them men up. Instead, there would be up-and-comers, people like Kibani Savage, who would also be responsible for sending kids to heaven far too early. It was a devastating fire early. On October morning, 6 people, including 4 young children, would die in a fire at this 2-story row home at 6 and Glenwood Avenue in North Philadelphia. And now federal authorities would charge one of Philly's most feared men since the days of the Black Mafia. Drug kingpin Kibani Savage, 3 of his associates, with nearly a dozen murders, including the 6 that occurred on that October morning. Everybody was subject to become victims if you got in the way of Kibani. If you were getting money and you were in the way, you would find yourself by yourself, taking your last breath. Murder and mayhem was part of this underworld. Witnesses against the crew were also fair game. It did not matter if you were working for the police in this world. In Philly, the police could not save you. Witnesses in state court, witnesses in federal court, and not one was off limits when Kibani had his sights on you. If they could not get you, they murdered the families of witnesses, including children. Safe on these mean streets of Philly? Not happening. But why the kids and why the fire? The feds say that Savage and his cohorts set the arson to silence former associate Eugene Coleman, who may have been cooperating with authorities. The 6 dead were Coleman's relatives, including his mother. A crime that could earn the conspirators the ultimate penalty, a well-deserved death penalty. All I can say is just pure evil. That's what describes the actions of Kibani Savage and his gang of thugs. Kibani would pen words, tears of rage. I'm flooded, internally. From him, almost drown myself every night, man. Tears of rage, because these sons of bitches going to pay, man. They going to pay, or my name ain't what it is. My pop's name wasn't what it was. They going to pay. They kids going to pay. They mama's going to pay. I know you get tired of me saying it, man, but that's the kind of conviction I got for this shit. Man, I'm dedicated to their death. Man, they better hope and pray I go to jail for a long time. It don't matter, because while I'm still living, I'm going to get them. Kibani's words were vicious, and he meant every one of them. Was he Philly's most brutal kingpin? This is a tale of one of Philadelphia's most dangerous men, according to federal prosecutors. It is the story of one kid's dreams to be a kingpin at all costs. When it was all said and done, there would be murder convictions tacked to his belt. As we said before, no one was off limits in Philly. If they crossed a man bent on violence and getting money all the wrong ways, then they would pay with their lives. Kibani's story is more than what you read in a fiction book. Even more so, this is not fiction nor a movie, but all facts. Perhaps he was gifted the right last name for who he would become, a savage, many would say. Kibani Savage would eventually be charged with his first murder charge in Pennsylvania, but would he also be able to beat it? This case could be the end of Kibani and somehow save the community from his wrath, but fate wouldn't have it that way. Back then, people were beating these cases in the state. The consequences were high and could come with a life sentence. With money comes power and high-priced lawyers. The case was nothing for the lawyers he was able to hire, or was it the people on the streets that made it all happen? The jury would come back and find Kibani not guilty, and the streets were his once again, screaming, crying, calling his name. Was it the lawyers that got him back his freedom, or was it the key players on the streets? Like in all prosecutions, the state would have to turn over the names of their witnesses before trial. The prosecution would do so, and it would cost someone their life. That somebody was the only person that could put Kibani at the scene of the crime with the smoking gun in his hand on the eve of Kibani's trial. Tobias Tip Flowers, a professional fighter, would take his last breath. He too had become a victim of Kibani's doing. He was set to be the witness in the senseless killing of Kenneth Lassiter, after Lassiter's car bumped into Savage's while the two were trying to park their respective cars. The violence had always been there, and it was just getting started. There was a lot more to come. According to federal prosecutors, Kebani would become famous for all the wrong reasons. He became an American drug dealer, organized crime leader, and all the way, a murderer. Kebani lived a life that some would describe as fictional if it had not been witnessed by others. He lived that life and was about that business where the streets of Philly can be as ruthless as a starving hyena. As a child, some would think he was just an average kid, but the savagery was part of his makeup since the day he was born. Kebani was an amateur boxer that would go on to have one professional fight that he won. While there was a lot of famous fighters in Philly, Kebani had other plans. He would not be one. Boxing was not in the cards for him. He had bigger dreams, or so he thought. His life of crime and drug dealing began in Huntington Park with the mind of an aspiring young entrepreneur. It would not be long before he would reach the top and become Philly's new Kingpin. He'd seen all the dudes before him getting money and wreaking havoc on the streets. Now it was his turn. Kebani Savage and his partner Jarrell Thomas ran a massive cocaine and crack manufacturing and distribution organization in Philadelphia. It was not a short run and not really a long one, with violence at every step of the way. In short time, the feds knew that they had to get Kebani and his crew off the streets. They would zero in on Kebani. Everyone knew who he was, and there was pressure to get him off the streets. Pressure had been known to burst pipes. Other times, it created diamonds. In this case, the pipes were ready to burst. Kebani had a stash house in an apartment at the village of Stony Run in Mapleshade, New Jersey. And this is when it all really started. That is where they would rack kilos of cocaine on a chilly September day. But the feds were watching, lurking, and they had been for a while. Just like Kebani's victims, once they were in his sight, there was no way to escape. The cops, too, were not letting Kebani escape. He had a destiny and never knew it until they had him. His destiny? Death row. Cops would search the apartment, finding scales, packaging materials, 4 metal presses, 7 metal press molds, 2 hydraulic jack cans for household items with false bottoms, and cocaine. He was at the top. He was really getting that bag. Kebani had become the master of re-rocking coke, increasing his profits. But those profits would soon come to an end when the police finally showed up to end his reign of terror. He would be arrested along with Eugene Coleman and 2 others, Elliot Bradley and Jasmine Vidal, on local drug trafficking charges. For him, it didn't seem that serious, but little did he know, this was just a small part of the bigger picture for the feds. On the evening then they were arrested while standing outside the Mapleshade Police Department cell block where Savage, Bradley, and Coleman were being housed, there was an agent. Agent Luzes standing in the distance. He would overhear a conversation among the 3 men. Coleman would tell Savage that Savage should have taken responsibility for all the cocaine processing materials found in the apartment at the time of their arrest. Savage replied that he wouldn't do that unless the police guaranteed that Bradley and Coleman would walk out of jail without being charged. Savage said that the police would not do that, so he would not admit to anything. "I'm not telling those people that shit was mine. What'd I look like doing that?" Savage told Bradley and Coleman. He'd then respond, "Don't worry, because your bail will be paid. And you should stay silent and not tell law enforcement about the items found in the apartment, and that they should take it to their graves. If we all keep our mouths shut, no one goes down." Savage told Coleman and Bradley that we know what we do for a living, and when we get out, we'll just start the shit all over again. He assured his people, as all good leaders do, that they would be all right, that their stay in jail would be short-lived. Savage would eventually be released from custody and placed on house arrest at his mother's house on North Darien Street in the summer. But that arrest would not stop his drug dealing. Like he said, he will start this shit all over again when we get out. Kebani thought he was unstoppable, but the feds, they had bigger plans. From his mother's home on Darien Street, he was back in business. The streets had too much money for him to leave there. How could he ever walk away? Kebani thought he was unstoppable, but the feds were there trying to stop him. They were already locked in and had one plan, and that was to end Kebani's life as he knew it. Kebani's man, Coleman, not true to his word to Savage inside the cell block that he would keep his mouth shut, would soon meet with law enforcement seeking a deal. He knew that things were about to go bad when the cops had approached him. Coleman would meet with the cops and outline their inner workings, the inner workings of Kebani's organization. Eugene Coleman would become one of the makers of the case and was now one of the government's instrumental cooperating witnesses. Coleman would continue to meet with law enforcement in an effort not to go to jail. Some already thought that he was snitching. During those proffers, he was outlining the inner workings of Kobani's organization. He was giving them the plan, giving them everything that they needed. Coleman's assistants would help cops secure a wiretap of Thomas's cell phone from September through March, during which thousands of calls between Thomas and Kobani Savage and some of the people involved in the dirty business of his inner workings. They were giving the cops more and more with each call. They were telling on themselves and didn't even know it. What cops were hearing on those calls would also lead to a warrant for Kobani's phone. And once they had it, it was Kobani that was painting the picture, leading to what would soon be his demise. Almost immediately after the judge issued the wiretap, federal agents would learn that Wendell Mason was the plug to Thomas. The intercepted calls would show that Savage was the leader of an extensive operation that moved hundreds of kilos of cocaine in and around the great state of Pennsylvania. With more calls, agents had all they needed to get a warrant to bust into Wendell Mason's home. There they would find kilos of pure cocaine and plenty of cash. As evidence mounted, the feds felt they had enough and they would soon come knocking. Today was their day, and this time, they felt Kobani would never get an acquittal. Everybody wanted him off the streets, from cops to prosecutors to politicians, and even those in the community. People were afraid of him. The ruthlessness and senseless killings would only escalate if he stayed on the streets, one cop would say. But today was the day. It was showtime. When they showed up, he acted surprised and never could see that this shit just got all the way real. The cold metal from the handcuffs would bite into Kobani's skin, and in that moment, his fate would be sealed even though he didn't know it. He would die in prison, or would he find a way out? Only time would tell. The feds knew they were playing with a savage and that everyone could become collateral damage. Even with Kobani in jail, there were still ways that he could make people victims and make things happen. The feds held back nothing and knew that they still had to go hard. Sometimes we see things in movies and think they only happen there. But the feds were about to do something that no one ever thinks of. Because they knew that Kobani was working the system and that he wanted his reign of ruthlessness to stay intact. With more people cooperating, agents would learn more of what Kobani was doing from jail and that he was seeking to put people to sleep from his prison cell. A federal judge in the Eastern District of PA signed an order authoring interception of oral communications of Kobani's prison cell and surrounding areas. They had access spaces. The feds had got into the jail, and they had to get more evidence to seal Kobani's fate. They were looking for evidence of the murders he was responsible for, and they knew that Kobani would give it to them. On some secret moves, they installed the equipment and were ready. Kobani had no idea what was to come. From November until the new year, cops would listen in while Kobani sat in his cell, doing time and telling on himself. Savage and his neighboring cellmates, primarily Al Shannon Moose and co-defendant Bay, communicated frequently over the course of the day, and Savage often communicated to others through the toilet bowl to inmates in other prison cells. The cops had tapped his prison cell, and during those months, Kobani would give them more than they could bargain for. Kobani would lay out plans in disturbing detail to eliminate witnesses and their families. Kobani had no cut cards and was not bluffing. Again, no one was off limits, even if the man was in prison. Victims were being lined up. If they thought you were talking, or would, you were on the list. If you crossed Kobani, he would be there to retaliate. Revenge. He wanted every bit of it. Kobani had an inclination that his once trusted guy, Eugene Coleman, was now working with them boys. His blood would boil and he wanted something done to him. Again, he was thirsty for blood and had solid soldiers in the street that would make it happen if he called the shot. And that he did. That is when he decided even family members had to pay. In the city of brotherly love, that love had become hate. The fire department would respond to a fire at the block of North Street. When the units arrived, they observed the house at North Street fully engulfed in flames. The flames would dance from the roof. After extinguishing the flames, fire department officials would find 6 bodies in the upstairs bedrooms. The victims were young and old, and they were identified as Marcella Coleman, the mother of Eugene Coleman, her niece Tama Nash, Coleman's adopted sister, Nash's daughter Khadijah Nash, Marcella Coleman's grandsons, one who was only 1 year old, and another child, the last victim, a family friend that was just spending the night. Anthony Rodriguez would take his last breath in that house as well. Investigators later determined that this was an intentional fire and that someone was behind it. That someone, Kobani Savage. How no one got out of the house was mind-boggling, but the one thing that was apparent was someone did this on purpose. That someone, the shot caller from a prison cell. Even the jail bars could not keep Kobani from still wreaking havoc in the worst ways on the streets of Philly. When kids die, it doesn't get any worse. The victims died of smoke inhalation and exposure to the fire. A gas can was located in the residence. The fire was ruled an arson and all the deaths ruled homicides. The family members of Coleman had been hit, and like the things you see only in movies, had just happened in Philadelphia. One day before the arson, Coleman was brought over to the FBI interview room for a meeting with law enforcement agents, his counsel, and counsel for the government. While being transported, Coleman encountered Savage in a nearby cell, who menacingly pointed to Coleman with his hand in the shape of a gun. Savage had been transported to the court the same day for a hearing concerning a potential conflict of counsel. The two should have never seen each other, but the plan was already in. There was nothing Coleman could do to save them. They had been marked for death. The very next day, after his proffer, his family would be demolished, destroyed, no longer existing. All these plans were outlined by Cabani as he instructed his sister to make things happen, all recorded on jail phones prior to them happening, and on video surveillance. And now there was more people to line up in Cabani's circle. Again, another judge would grant permission to listen in on Cabani's visits at the jail with his family. The feds wanted more evidence of the destruction that he had caused in October. Savage received a visit at the FDC from his mother Barbara Savage and his sister Kadada Savage. During the visit, Savage asked how Lamont Lewis was doing. He was the man behind the fire and would eventually testify to what he had done. On the stand, he would say that he spoke to Cabani in the evening hours of October 8, 2004, at which time Cabani told Lewis that Savage needed Lewis to carry out a favor for him, a favor for a favor. Savage told Lewis that his sister would explain the plan after the phone call. Shortly after that, his sister advised Lewis of the plan to firebomb the Coleman residence and drove Lewis to the location to identify the Coleman house for Lewis. In the early morning hours of October 9, 2004, Lewis contacted Merritt and explained the plan to him. Lewis and Robert Merritt filled up 2 gas cans while en route to the Coleman residence. And while Lewis gained entry and fired warning shots into the residence, Merritt threw a gas can with a lit cloth fuse and then a second gas can into the occupied Philadelphia row house in the pre-dawn hours on October 9, 2004. That house had become a mausoleum. Barbara Savage responded that he was upset, but that he was calming down when talking about Lewis after the devastation. Savage discussed with Barbara and his sister that various people of Savage's associates continued to owe him money, and he instructed his sister to help with collecting those debts. Additionally, Savage would tell his sister to tell Cuzzo, Savage's cousin, Raymond Wilmore, to go get Kurt a reference to Curtis Singleton, who was pistol whipped by Savage after he was accused by Cabani of stealing drug proceeds. An incident that formed the basis for one of the firearm charges that he would be charged with. When his sister told him that Kurt was not home yet, Cabani said to tell Lamont Lewis that that dude came down here and said something, meaning he was talking. He's a rat. Savage advised Kadia and Barbara that he did not know what he said, but to make sure that Kurt does not come to court in November. With the feds listening and watching, they would learn during another family visit at the FDC that Cabani Savage was attempting to order things to happen with the use of hand gestures. A little hood sign language. This was observed by the FBI as they watched the concealed video surveillance of the meeting during one particular hand gesture. His faithful sister was painting her own destiny again. She held her hand in the shape of a gun and pretended to pull the trigger of the gun 3 times. According to cops, they were not sure what this meant, as Kadida was whispering and her mouthing her words at the time. But they had a plan for her ass too. Although the visiting room was divided by glass, they had a 2-way telephone to assist the communication between inmates and their visitors. The Savages made no attempt to use the telephone during any of their visits. It was all sign language. The cards were being stacked against him. In many instances, he became the master of his own demise. Cabani was serving himself up on a platter to the feds and had no clue that he was being recorded at every step of the way. The calls that were being intercepted showed that he was at the head of one of the most ruthless drug organizations Philly had ever seen. Some of Savage's people, including other inmates, would tell Savage that by the time of the trial, everybody be dead. From the toilet bowls, they were shitting on themselves with their words as cops recorded their shitty conversations. Savage replied, "We're just getting started. The night's still young, my boy." And another commenting on Eugene Coleman's mother, Marcella Coleman, who perished in the October arson. Savage would state, "I'm glad that bitch died. They should have put barbecue sauce on her ass." Savage stated that Coleman was trying to hurt Savage by testifying against him, so Savage was going to try and hurt him. On an intercepted call, Cabani said that when he sees them around in the city, he's going to get their ass and their kids, everybody going to pay. Cabani told another prisoner about a previous conversation he had with a co-defendant, Malik Jones, when Kabani had heard that Jones was thinking about cooperating. Kabani said he asked Jones, "What you going to do? Where you going to live? I'm the only one locked up out of my crew, and they out there waiting just like puppies and hound dogs." Paul Daniels, another co-defendant, would plead guilty, and he too would cooperate. He would tell federal prosecutors that he learned that Kabani told people that he was cooperating. Mr. Bay, one of Kabani's right hands, would personally tell Daniels through jail bars that kept him safe for the moment, that all I need is one phone call or one visit, and then watch my magic, bitch. Daniel was Savage's partner's son, Gerald Thomas, and he did not want to go to prison in order to avoid a lengthy jail sentence. He took a chance with his life in every meaning of the word. A week after meeting at the federal building while housed in the same jail, Daniels would be summoned to talk through the toilet bowl, a way of communicating with other prisoners from cell to cell. Daniels was in a cell on another floor right below the people who were once his friends. Dawood Bey and Savage would tell him, quote unquote, the feds were bluffing, that he was going to kill Daniels' son. When Daniels stated that he could not hear a part of the conversation, Daniels could not make out the word bluffing. Savage remarked, "Oh, he can't hear me now? I'm going to kill his son." Dawood Bey repeated Savage's statement. He said, "He's going to kill your son, bro." Savage was not bluffing, and Daniels knew that he was in the killing business. In November, the feds would intercept another toilet bowl call. Savage and Moose were discussing how Paul Daniels approached Gerald Thomas and talked about cooperating. Savage said that they, Daniels and others, were hollering up through the bowl, so he told them to put that dude Daniels on. Savage then described the conversation between him and Daniels. He like, "Oh no, I was just trying to get out the way." I said, "Remember what you said, dude, because I want you to keep in mind one thing. I'm the only one locked up out of my crew. And Dawood Bey, the only one locked up out of his crew. Think about what you're going to do, man, because your son, he history, man. Why are you getting into that? I'm listening. I got to tell you how I feel. Everything must go." The feds would eventually have enough, and now it was time to take Kabani to the federal building. He would go to trial on the drug charges just before Christmas, and it was a show that the feds knew they were winning and would win. As if it was a Christmas present for the feds, the jury would come back soon on a cold December day with a finding of guilt on the drug charges. When sentencing day came, the government argued that Savage had sold numerous kilos of cocaine in the city of Philadelphia, destroying the people and the community. They would tell the court that they wanted a life sentence and life in prison. Though it was the least of his worries in the end, the judge would impose a sentence of 30 years, likely knowing that Kabani had more charges coming, charges that would eventually cost him his life. Another indictment was dropped while Kabani was serving his 30-year term. This time, the stakes were higher. Kabani would be charged with numerous murders, including those from the firebombing. The government would also seek the ultimate penalty, the death penalty, as part of the indictment. The feds had also arrested Popeye Lamont Lewis, the alleged perpetrator of the firebombing. Federal prosecutors were going hard. They wanted a conviction, and they wanted Kabani to be put in the chair that no one ever gets up from. They wanted his life in every sense of the meaning. The trial would start and go on for weeks. Friends and those he trusted were now changing sides, and Popeye was no different. He would become the government's star witness in the firebombings, outlining all that happened, and with it lining up Kabani's faithful sister. The feds would march witnesses in that were once his soldiers. The jurors seemed disgusted that Kabani could order kids to be demolished with no remorse. Savage's life would forever change. The jurors walked into the courtroom, some with their heads down, others looked on in disgust. Perhaps he already knew what his fate would be. Guilty, the foreperson would yell out when asked if they had a verdict. Life for him was forever gone. Now, he would only see his beloved city in pictures. He would never see the streets of Philly ever again. His destination, the concrete jungle. Next would be the sentencing phase. Would the jury find that Kabani should be strapped to a deathbed and pumped with drugs that would take his last breath? Would the government be permitted to do as he did? The jury ordered that Kabani be sentenced to death, and not long after, the federal judge made it official, ordering that the death penalty be fulfilled for Philly's most dangerous man. In fact, the judge imposed death sentences. And Popeye, he too was sentenced to 40 years despite his cooperation. Merritt, the person who was alleged to have thrown the gas cans into the house, was spared the death penalty, but he too sentenced to life. Today is serving his life sentence in New Jersey at FCI Farrington. As for Kabani's sister, she too found the same fate as Merritt, life in prison, and today she is at FCI Tallahassee. Kabani Savage is now at ADX Florence, still fighting, but fighting a fight that seems inevitable. In his words, tears of rage. I'm flooded internally. From him, almost drown myself every night, man. Tears of rage. because these son of a bitches going to pay. Man, they going to pay or my name ain't what it is. My pop name wasn't what it was. They going to pay. They kids going to pay. They mama's going to pay. I know you get tired of me saying it, man, but that's the kind of conviction I got from this shit, man. I'm dedicated to their death, man. They better hope and pray I go to jail for a long time. It don't matter, because while I'm still living, I'm going to get them. Life in the feds is life, and the death penalty is real. This man thought he was only going to prison for a long time. He didn't realize that these people were about to put him in a chair and put him to sleep. Leave your comments. Tell me what you think. Do you think he should have gotten the ultimate penalty, the death penalty?